All right. Good evening and welcome to our history, theology, and philosophy lecture series. I'm excited to be coming to you tonight to talk about this topic, mapping the medieval worldview. This is actually was my area of special focus in graduate school, and anyway, the history of medieval maps and how they work is one of the things that there's only maybe a dozen people, a couple dozen people maybe at most on the planet that know as much about this as I do. So anyway, I'm happy to be able to be talking about this, and I think it's actually also going to be very interesting. We're happy to be back. We do these lectures almost every Tuesday on a wide variety of topics encompassing the fields of history, theology, and philosophy. We've been off for a couple weeks for our summer break, and we're excited to get back into them. My name's John Hamer. I serve as pastor of the Community of Christ Toronto congregation. My background, as I mentioned a minute ago, is in history academically, and that's going to be the focus tonight. We always begin our activities at Center Place with our mission, which is to invite everyone into community, to continually learn and grow, to abolish poverty and end needless suffering, to promote peace and justice, and to live life meaningfully together, as our goal overall is then to build community together. As always, we remember that our programming and our capacity to do these live streams is listener supported. Leandro's just been finishing some of the financial reports, and so anyway, we really do appreciate all the donations that you guys have been giving. And if you would like to, if you appreciate these lectures or our other streaming programming, we invite you to go to our website, centerplace.ca, and there's a big red button, support Centerplace. And or often we have a donate button if you're watching this live streamed on Facebook. Thank you so much for your support. Next week, our lecture is entitled Pagan Vikings versus Christians. And we're going to look at the kind of history of the medieval Viking raids, especially on the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of early central medieval Britain, and also on the Frankish kingdom, what later becomes France. And specifically, one of the things that people have kind of asked, and the reason why we did this, I think, lecture, put it together in the first place, was we'd had some people in our group ask, how is it in this what seems like quite a dark age of warriors that you have these religions of pagan Vikings, the Norse gods, Thor and Odin, these warrior gods, and this idea of warriors having honorable deaths and making their way to Valhalla. How is it, in a way, that these guys, and also specifically this religion, when it squares off against Christianity, whose God is crucified on a cross, who is known as the Prince of Peace, how is it in this kind of very martial age that Christianity wins out, and in fact all of the Norse kingdoms, all of Scandinavia, ultimately becomes Christian? And so we're going to look at what are the reasons, institutional and otherwise, why that dynamic played out the way it did. So that'll be an interesting lecture, I think, as well. That'll be next Tuesday at 8 o'clock Eastern. Today, as I mentioned, we are talking about mapping the medieval world, and we're going to look at a whole bunch of maps. I absolutely love maps. I like maps from all eras, from antiquity through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and to the present. But we're not always aware, I think, of how radically both the form of maps, the purpose of maps, and indeed even the idea of maps, how radically that has changed, including even in our own lifetimes. We are so much more, we're most carrying maps around with us in Apple Maps and Google Maps, and we are constantly now, aware of where we are map-wise, I think, in a way that just didn't even isn't even conceivable 20 years ago, much less 100 years ago, in terms of how much less people viewed the world as a map. We now view everything with maps, and we have our whole picture of the world with maps. And we have a very particular way that we look at maps. So we'll look about that tonight. First off, I want to have just a brief background. So what is the Middle Ages? So we're talking about medieval. And so the word medieval actually comes from the Latin media Iowa, which just means Middle Ages. And so I've got my Monty Python and the Holy Grail here, guys, that's actually a pretty, as far as the King Arthur stories, it's actually one of the more accurate representations of King Arthur. But anyway, what is this meant by when we're talking about this historically, the Middle Ages? And so at a certain point, and that point actually is in modernity, when people decided suddenly that they were now living in modern times, they created a threefold division of time in the history of Western civilization. The first portion is called antiquity, which is essentially this is people in the West, for people, all of human history, recorded history, once writing first exists, all the way down until, let's say, around 476, about the time of the fall of Rome, the Western Roman Empire. And then, let's say, starting at the end of the 15th century, so whether you're going to date it from 1492 when Columbus sails across the ocean and we have the Columbian exchange, the renewed interaction, or the first massive interaction between the Eastern and Western hemispheres that just changed the world, or whether you want to date it from 1453, which is when the East Roman Empire, Constantinople, falls to the Ottoman Turks. In either way, however, that sort of time period, that's modern times. And then what the people who now they're saying, well, we're living in modern times, what they said was, well, there's this time between this great time of the ancient Roman times and our great time that we're living in now, the modern times, and that time is the middle times, the middle time that in between. You might expect people didn't wake up in the year 500 and say, well, now we're living in the middle times. Everybody in their own to their own perspective, they're always living in now, and they're not thinking of their time ever as being middle, or medieval, obviously, or frankly ancient. They were living now then too, back in ancient times. So we've had a whole lecture before on Gothic architecture, and so this idea of Gothic, and so again, this is another medieval architecture that's characteristic, especially in terms of the development in northern France, but it really spread across, again, the whole medieval West. And in a lot of ways, this was a innovative and, for its time, daring, modern, different from anything that had went before. This is not simply trying to copy what Romans had. These things that we're seeing here as we are zoomed in on a medieval cathedral, a Gothic cathedral. We're seeing flying buttresses, engineering feats that, frankly, the Romans hadn't done. And so there was continual advance, actually technological advance, in what we sometimes think of as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. It was not a time period when all of these engineering, for example, capacities were all lost. There was advance, especially in military equipment, because it's hard to go back once you learn, some new military equipment. Okay, so even though we call this Gothic, it actually has nothing to do with the Goths. The Goths had been one of these Germanic confederations that had invaded the Roman Empire at the time of the Roman Empire's collapse. And the Ostrogoths, who were the peoples, which just means Eastern Goth, Visigoth means Western Goth. The Ostrogoths had conquered Italy and had set up a kingdom in Italy. They were extinct by the middle of the 6th century. The Visigoths, who had conquered Spain and had a kingdom out there, were extinct in the 8th century. Gothic architecture so-called, this is a term that is introduced just a couple hundred years ago. So it's not what people called it back then. And they certainly wouldn't have thought of themselves as Goths, because the Goths were extinct by the time it was created. It was essentially originated in the 12th century, which is many, many centuries after when there were Goths. And at the time, people called it either new architecture or modern architecture, or sometimes they called it French architecture, because it was, again, sort of developed and first debuted in kind of the Paris region. Saint Denis, which is the royal monastery where almost every one of the kings of France for over 1,000 years are buried in this monastery north of Paris, Saint Denis, which is the first real Gothic cathedral, as we might call it. It's not really a cathedral, but anyway, this first Gothic church. And this is again, you look at this thing, it doesn't even, it's hard to imagine that people so long ago could build something where it's essentially so tall and all windows. This is the Sainte-Chapelle, the royal chapel on the Ile de Paris. So this is the isle, it's the king's royal chapel that's on the center, the island in the center of the Seine in Paris. And it's just really a gorgeous and amazing thing that not unlike anything what the Romans would have been doing. So, as I say then the idea of Middle Ages, so-called calling this the Middle Ages, was really born in the Italian Renaissance. And the Italian Renaissance, at the beginning of what we now think of as the modern era, or the end of the medieval era, is a very conscious Roman revival. And you can kind of see this here as a Renaissance idealized image of an ideal city, which is in a lot of ways a Roman revival of all these Roman forms. And in some ways the Italians hadn't gotten as far away from the Roman ruins and the Roman stuff, because they're living in the bulk of it, right? And so, but I will also mention that nobody in the West had ever thought of themselves as being very divorced from Roman times. They always felt that they were reviving, or actually maybe even in total continuity with the Roman Empire. They hadn't even necessarily had a sense that the Roman Empire had fallen. Certainly throughout the entire Middle Ages, the kings of Germany just called themselves Roman Emperor as their title, what we now call the Holy Roman Empire, but to make a distinction. But in fact, they just were calling themselves Emperor of the Romans, and so they felt that they were exactly just regular heirs of Julius Caesar and Augustus. Okay, so that's a little background on the medieval part. And now I want to look a little bit and maybe deconstruct a little bit our what we think of as a map. And so I mentioned right nowadays, probably for most of us, our everyday experience with maps is occurring on our phones and maybe on our computers, where we are looking at things like, this is Google Maps or Apple Maps, and you are just mapping everywhere you go. And so this is showing the location of Centre Place in downtown Toronto, and because of how Google works or how Apple works, I'm able to figure out how long it will take me to walk from here to any other place, or how long by a transit or by car or by plane, and it'll tell you all of those kind of things. And or we can go to satellite, you can see it 3D, you can go to Google Earth and pull back and see the whole planet. It's just an amazing way that we're now fully integrated with the idea of maps, but a very particular kind of map, which is one that there's a bunch of biases that are existing here in this map that we maybe don't unpack. And so one thing that actually is showing, and particularly in this map, is north is at the top. And so now we're really seeing, in a way that in old maps of Toronto you wouldn't have seen, that Toronto's street grid is not exactly set up directly north and south. The old maps would have been set up, with north and south at an angle, and you wouldn't see this at an angle like the actual city is. It's way more pronounced if you go to Montreal, where north is actually, really sideways to how it's thought of in the city. And other things is very prominent, prominently showing the coastline here, prominently showing the waterways, and specifically here also roads. And that's what we're really drawing here with the maps. So common features of maps as we understand them and use them in modernity is we primarily use these as representations of space. We generally show them proportionally with a scale, so longitude and latitude on the Earth here, in terms of, you can see in this particular map of North America, the longitude and latitude lines in this, so they're showing how they fit within the globe. As I say, they often highlight these physical features, especially coastlines, roads, often also political boundaries, and we always almost orient them with north at the top. And I can say that for myself, if I go to a city, if I get onto a city I've never been to before, and I get out of the airplane in the airport, and I somehow get myself turned around and I think that south is north, it's north is south, it is very hard for me to then, if I hang out in that city for a few days and I don't realize that I've been making my mental map, like what we might think of in map terms as upside down, it's actually kind of hard for me to then, when I later realize, oh wait, I was totally upside down. That's actually south is north. And so we really have a sense of that. It's actually hard for us to understand why, if we go to historic regions, why is Upper Egypt south of Lower Egypt? Why is Upper Germany south of Lower Germany, which is north? Why is Upper Canada south of Lower Canada? So all of those kind of geographical references from the past, we would never say that anymore. If we're going to have an Upper Carolina, it's North Carolina, Lower Carolina, South Carolina, Upper Dakota is North Dakota, so on and so forth. And the reason for it is, in the past, people weren't thinking in map terms. They were thinking in terms of going upriver. And so upriver means going up a hill. And so Upper Egypt is uphill from Lower Egypt, which is north, but is going down, the river's flowing to the north. So why is north at the top? Some of you may have seen maps like this where people try to challenge our just these inherent frameworks that we have with maps. And so when you look at this, you're thinking, oh wow, it's hard to even imagine here. Australia is a lot more prominent up there in the south, as we have south up, and just even looking at everything, which we can't help but think upside down, it is really it's disturbing in a way, right? But there's no particular reason why, in fact, actually, we couldn't do maps with south at the top. In fact, it's completely, from a scientific standpoint, it's essentially identical. It's a bias is because Europeans, who are the people who made the tradition of maps that we've inherited, lived in the northern hemisphere, and they just put it at the top of the paper. So, in point of fact, in the Middle Ages especially, and actually up until really modern times, when the Islamic world really became dominated by European Western science and things like that, there was a long-standing tradition of putting south at the top. So for most Muslim maps in the Middle Ages, south was at the top. And so for you guys to even look at this in a map, this is a beautiful map. This is al-Idrisi. He is a 12th century Muslim scholar who is working at the court of the Norman king of Sicily. So when the Normans conquered England, they also conquered Sicily, and there's in Sicily all of these Muslims, and there is a brilliant court in Palermo where the Norman king is actually patronizing Muslim scientists and poets, along with Greeks and Jews and also Latins. And one of the top scholars at this kind of glorious court is a Muslim scholar from North Africa named al-Idrisi, and he produces this amazing geography of the world, of which this is the world map. And so, again, probably for us, we're going to have to turn yourself upside down to see it. The whole southern component of this, the blank area, is this part of Africa that is south of the equator that was essentially unknown. So they didn't know anything that was going on in the southern hemisphere. And indeed, Greek and Arab science even believed maybe that you couldn't go down there because you get burned up if you went through that climate zone. And so as a result, it was terra incognita, but it was also potentially terra inaccessibilia. You could not get down there. And so you can kind of see in this map, the center of the map is actually the Arabian Peninsula. And so then that sea that goes out to the left is the Indian Ocean. The sea down to the right that's going near to the Arabian Sea, to Arabia there is the Mediterranean. And you can kind of see at the top center, there's these mountains and this river system that all comes together. That's the Nile and Egypt. And so Europe on this particular map is in the lower right-hand corner. And so you can kind of see Spain and Italy, and Sicily's the biggest island there, and the Balkans. And the little thing that's sticking up to the bottom is Denmark. And then therefore at the bottom, very bottom of this map is Scandinavia. So anyway, you can kind of see how this works. It's upside down from our actual expectations now, but it's a pretty reasonable map in terms of how we even understand what maps today and the modern maps and modern world. In point of fact, the original orientation in Christian maps, and indeed before Christians, in Romans and pagan Roman maps, was to have east at the top. And indeed, the reason why when we say we are trying to orient ourselves, I want to get myself oriented, that's because we are trying to turn so that the map is facing east, because east was at the top of the map. And so that was the Roman tradition that medieval Christians inherited. And so this is an example of a very simple schematic world map. We'll talk more about these TO maps when we talk about the different types of maps. But the main point I want to make here is that the whole reason why we even say we're getting ourselves oriented is because of the past tradition that was pretty much set in stone that east was going to be at the top of a Western map, a Christian map. So I'll mention that we also have in modernity a very serious focus on coastlines, and we're going to want to deconstruct why that should be. The reality of it is that for most of us, we aren't actually sailing around on boats anymore. We're not using maps for that kind of navigation. Nevertheless, the history of our maps is derived from merchant sea charts. And so that's why, for example, in this particular flag, this is the national flag of Cyprus, you have this outline of the island of Cyprus as their main element of what they're trying to present in order to get all the people on the island to uphold that as a symbol of national unity. Obviously, that hasn't particularly worked in this particular case on Cyprus, which remains a very divided island. But that's the idea, anyway, I think, of having the focus here be on coastlines, because people see that in the way they see maps. So the reason for that, as I'm saying, is that modern maps are primarily derived from medieval Mediterranean sea charts. And there's charts that are called Portolano charts. They're developed probably by 13th century medieval Italians and Catalans, so the people who were living around Barcelona, in what's now eastern Spain, Catalonia. Also somewhat in the Arab world, who are also involved a little bit at the same kind of time in this kind of mercantile Mediterranean actions. The purpose of these is navigation, and so in fact the coastline is the most important feature because of the way navigation worked. For most of antiquity and the Middle Ages, boats are not very good, and people didn't like to get away from seeing land. And so they would get out to the middle of the Mediterranean, and that would be very scary. Rather, they would prefer to just follow around the coast as much as is humanly possible, or maybe just to make the brief crossings at the thinnest parts between land. And that's what these kinds of maps are for. And so you can see in this, again, 13th century chart, that you can see Italy there very easily. You can see the Adriatic, you can see Tunisia and Libya, and so this is a very recognizable form already. And the reason for why is because our maps are derived, from this kind of map. The difference that we have here is that we don't use rhumb lines. So you see all these beautiful lines and these kind of line spirals that are all around as they're using these kind of wind cycles and things like that. So this is a different kind of tool that are used. You've probably seen like astrolabes. This is this, and sextants as these kind of different. It's a different kind of tool that they're using for these kind of lines. We later maps developed the longitude and latitude, the grid system that we're more familiar with. Okay, so even though we largely or almost entirely use those kinds of maps that are derived from medieval merchant and sailing maps, we nevertheless still do have some important schematic maps that we use fairly regularly. So in the case here in Toronto, for the subway system, this is a very common map. It's a little out of date now because they've extended the subway system. But in any way, the idea here is this is how the subway stations are linked in a schematic way with each other. This doesn't actually represent actual spatial difference because, in fact, the central stations are much more closely or densely packed, and the farther out you go, the longer, in fact, the distances between each of these dots. And so plotted against a real-life grid system with longitude and latitude, this would look just substantially different, but it's instead just shown schematically as straight lines with stations equidistant as shown on the scheme, because that's all you need in order to understand what this map is telling us. This map is telling us how do we get from station to station, and it's what line do you need to be on to get to that station, where do you need to transfer. It's not telling me where the Humber River is or where the coastline is, because in fact they don't need to know that for this kind of a map. And so so we do make use of schematic maps that are not simply telling us the information that we think of as a normal map information. And so it's important for us to recognize that that's what we think of as a normal map is simply a collection of our arbitrary decisions about what we want to consider to be important in maps, whereas we could make a whole bunch of other things important, and indeed people have done that throughout history, and we still do that in some cases, like with the schematic map of a transit line. An example of such a schematic map for transit is a map that's called the Peutinger Table. This is essentially it's essentially the only map, main map, or it's not the only map. Anyway, one of the main maps that has survived from Roman times, from the Roman Empire. It didn't quite survive, and so this would have been you can kind of see, there's two different versions of it here. So above is the actual map, which is this very long, skinny thing, and then I have taken a detail of it and I have blown up that detail, and so you're seeing kind of the blow up in the bigger portion of it. So this is a map that is 6.75 meters long by 1/3 of a meter tall. So it is a big, long, and skinny map that you can roll up. And even though it's those proportions, it is a map of the Roman Empire and really indeed the whole known Roman world. So this is a Roman world map, and as you're probably aware, Romans are sort of known for making roads. And so what it actually is showing is the entire Roman road network and all of the major towns or stopping points along the road network and how the roads interact with each other. So it is almost the same thing as one of those subway maps that I showed. And what I've zoomed in on here, you can see that circle. That's a representation of Rome, and you can see all the roads leading into Rome. And so that is an actual representation of the phrase "all roads lead to Rome," right? And so that's actually happening on the Roman road map. This isn't actually, it didn't survive all the way. So this is actually a medieval copy, but it's a medieval copy that is very true to the original. So somebody in the middle, so the problem with anything surviving from Roman times is that paper doesn't survive. And so you have to have at some point or other somebody, a medieval monk, copying the thing out. And so in the Middle Ages, somebody this had survived, and somebody made a copy, and the copy now, the old one didn't survive, and so the copy has survived. And so it's amazing that we have this. But you can see that this is very schematic. If you look at the top little tiny version I have on this, of this 7 meter long and third of a meter tall map, you can see the areas here that are the oceans. They are not being concerned here about coastlines. They're not being concerned about a grid where space is equally distantly presented. They are showing this in a very schematic way in order to have a very useful road map. And so it's actually very much squishing and expanding out the Roman Empire, like making it much skinnier than it actually is. And so this is a very interesting map that we have that survives. Okay, so now it looks at some medieval maps, and as we are going to be talking about medieval maps, I want to address a very commonly held modern myth. There's a modern myth where people believe that people in the Middle Ages believed that the world was flat, and indeed it's usually even associated with a story that Columbus was trying to prove the world was round, and at a certain point his sailors were getting very nervous because they felt they were getting to the edge of the flat earth and they were going to fall off the side of it, and that Columbus somehow proved the world was round. And so none of that is actually true. That's a 19th century myth that was made up for various reasons in teaching to American school kids. And so that is not the case. So I can even just show you here. Here's a medieval manuscript from Walter of Metz, who has a text that's called An Image of the World from the 13th century. You can see his illustration as he's talking about the sphericity of the world, and you can see there's two diagrams. So the two guys, there's a guy in a red outfit and a guy in a blue outfit, and they are on a spherical world. And then in the second diagram below, you can see that if they kept walking, he was suggesting, the red guy would get halfway around the world, and you'd see he would be sitting on the world sideways. And then ultimately, if they kept walking, and if there was enough land that this would work, then they would get to the bottom of the world and they'd be standing upside down. This is a very well-known principle of just explaining the Earth's sphericity. This is a medieval diagram. There's plenty more of these where the medieval people are explaining that they understand that the world is a sphere. The medieval scholars are all heirs to Greek and Roman knowledge of the Earth's sphericity. So Romans knew the world was a sphere. The Greeks did. The Greeks actually were able to very accurately measure the circumference of the Earth even. What Columbus was actually trying to prove was that the Greek calculation for the Earth's circumference was way too big, and that he was suggesting that the Earth was much skinnier and more oblong, and that he would be able to get to Japan. He was quite wrong, and he would have been very in a lot of danger if there had been just ocean. If there hadn't been this accidental existence of another continent in the way, that would quite luckily saved him and his crew, who needed to take on food and supplies and everything like that. So people knew that the Earth was a sphere. The medieval people always used words like globus, orbis, spheri, globe, orb, sphere, to describe the world, which they knew was a sphere or a ball. And this pretty clear diagram here explains the idea. Indeed, one of the major traditions that we're going to talk about in medieval maps is, in fact, entirely about the Earth's sphericity. So this is a type of map which we call Macrobian world maps because they are associated with a late antique, early medieval writer named Macrobius. And so he talked about, he made kind of an encyclopedia, a curriculum for schools, and he talked about essentially how the Earth's geography works. And so what we're seeing here in this diagram, which is a medieval world map in this Macrobian tradition, is a map with, actually in this case, north at the top. And what we're really seeing here is the known world in the northeastern hemisphere. And so you can see there's these lines. So ignore the lines for a second. But you can see Europe is kind of in the upper northeast corner, and then Turkey and the Caspian Sea. Arabia is down at the, there's an intervening line that says Oceanus, the ocean. There's an area there that's Africa and Arabia that is the south of the top part. And then there's this other continent that's south of the northeastern hemisphere, which is the Antiochi and the Antipodes. And so what is this showing? So you're seeing here essentially the eastern hemisphere, the northeastern part, which is the known world as far as medieval Christians are concerned, the southeastern hemisphere, which is unknown but is assumed to have a continent of comparable size to Eurasia, Africa, which Africa is not understood in this case to extend below the equator. And so what it's actually showing here is the consequences of the Earth's sphericity, which is that the Earth is separated into climate zones, 5 climate zones. There's the Arctic at the top, which is frigid. There's the temperate zone, which is where everybody wants to live. This is essentially the zone of the Roman Empire, so the Romans thought of that as the best zone. And then there's the torrid zone, which is the area that as you get closer and closer to the equator, which is going to get so hot that you'll burn on fire and you won't be able to cross it. And then they're explaining that they know very well then as you go further south, though, because the Earth is a sphere, there'll be another temperate zone, and then finally another frigid zone, the Antarctic zone. And so what they generally understood, I think I got a diagram here the next time. Yeah, so they generally understood in antiquity and in the Middle Ages that there are, in fact, 4 semi-hemispheres, of which the known world is the oikoumene, the part of the world, the whole world that we know about. Then there's the part that is opposite us, the Antiochi, in terms of us being when we lived in the Eastern Hemisphere. Anyway, so the people who would be in the Southeastern Hemisphere, across to where we are now in North America is where the Perioiki are, and then finally the people that are living upside down, the people that are totally on the bottom of the world as far as from the perspective of the people in the oikoumene, the people in the perspective of Rome, are the Antipodes. And so there's this idea that there's these 4 semi-hemispheres, and because it's theorized, actually, you can't probably cross the torrid zone. But even though the Romans understood that you probably could get to the Perioiki area, they didn't actually ever try. And so it's actually kind of an interesting theoretical thing that was mostly left to philosophers to speculate about. Philosophers and then later theologians. Aristotle said things like nature abhors a vacuum, so he believed that you couldn't possibly have these other 4 continental zones which existed if they didn't have people on them. So there are people down there, but can we ever talk to them? And that becomes a very concerning thing for medieval Christian theologians. If there's these people down there in the Antipodes, and we can't actually cross the torrid zone to get to them, how are they ever going to learn about the message of Christ? How are they ever going to be brought the gospel? And so that is something that they were actually quite worried about. They were not worried that anybody was going to fall off the Earth because it's a sphere. Even the simple maps, and we're going to get to these, the TO maps, they also represent spheres, and so we'll talk about this. So on the left here is a diagram. It's a seal or a representation anyway of the Emperor Otto, and so this is the medieval Holy Roman Emperor, the German Emperor, and he's holding, on the one hand, he's holding a sword. He's got a crown. He's sitting on a throne. These are ways that we know that he's a ruler. But he's holding in one of his hands here a sphere. And you can see what those spheres look like on the right. I think that one's out of the British crown jewels. But in any event, it's the same thing. It's the spheres representing dominion over the world, which everybody, all the medieval people understand is a sphere. That's why they made these things. And it's got a cross on top to show, again, it's Christendom, the dominion. And you can see in the emperor's hands, the circle is divided into a T. And we'll talk about that, but essentially, if you can read it, it actually says Asia, Europa, and Africa. And so it's a sphere, and it's showing the divisions of the oikomenoi, the part of the known world that the Romans and medieval people knew about, and it's separated into the three continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa. Okay, so you probably have heard, when one of the things that the Age of Exploration was doing was that when medieval people didn't know what was going on in the corners of the maps, they wrote, "Here there be dragons," and slowly, what the Age of Discovery, what the era of exploration and mapping out the whole planet has been, is going around and finding, well, not finding any dragons actually. But actually, like so many things, a lot of times we think of, for example, like witch hunts and witch trials. Witch trials are largely something that occurs in modern times, not as much in medieval times. And likewise, Hic sunt dracones, here there be dragons, that really only starts appearing on modern maps, maps after the year 1500. There's only one medieval example where we have anything like that, which there's a 10th century map which says Hic Abundant Leones. In other words, here there be lions, here lions abound. And it's not necessarily, there probably aren't any lions there, but anyway, that's but they assumed that there were lions there. So anyway, there is something a little bit like that, and sometimes dragons would make their way onto the maps and things like that, but it's not always simply it's not entirely based on our modern conceptions of what medieval maps are like. We're mostly used to early Age of Discovery maps. So in other words, early modern maps as opposed to medieval maps. This is a really interesting map that we will talk about. This is a 10th century map that is called, it's called the Cotton Map, or it's called the Anglo-Saxon Map, because it was produced in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England in the 10th century, and it has a one town that's labeled in Anglo-Saxon, but otherwise it is a fairly reasonable copy of a Roman map. It's maybe a copy of a copy of a copy, and so it's actually, as we mentioned before, east is at the top of Roman maps, and so when we're seeing, there's a call out here, but if you look at the map on the left, there's the full known world, of which east is the top, and so if you want to recognize it, you got to turn your head sideways. And so the middle here is in the ocean, and that's in the middle is the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And so England, on its side, then the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, is in the lower left-hand corner, and you can see how Cornwall is jutting out. There's a lot of characteristics of how Romans understood their world to be, as we've seen in other Roman remnants that are preserved in this map. Regarding this idea of here there be dragons, this is not simply a complaint that modern people have had about the medievals. Plutarch, who is a writer in the 1st century AD, complained about geographers of his day. In other words, in Roman times, he says, geographers crowd into the edges of their maps parts of the world which they do not know about, adding notes in the margin to the effect of, beyond this lies nothing but sandy deserts full of wild beasts, unapproachable bogs, Scythian ice, or a frozen sea. I might very well say of those that are farther off, beyond this there is nothing but prodigies and fictions. The only inhabitants are the poets and inventors of fables. There is no credit or certainty any farther. So Plutarch was already identifying that already in Roman times there's a tendency when you get past the known world to start just filling it up with all kinds of fantasies and poets making up stuff. The problem is that once people make up ideas like that and they tell about unicorns and they tell about all kinds of wild and crazy stuff, people get attracted to those ideas. And so Romans made up all of these ideas, and then medieval people, believing that the Romans knew what they were talking about, continued to copy those things and not necessarily particularly being aware of the stuff that's more yellow journalism or whatever, as opposed to the more authentic sources. So that does happen. So I want to talk a little bit about the 4 major surviving types of maps of the world. So the Romans didn't even really have a word, the word map. Romans would have probably used the word carta, which we would use like chart for that. That would have been more what the Romans would say. By the time you get to the Middle Ages, the word that means napkin or cloth, mappa, is where that word comes from, and so then that is our modern word for map. In other words, something that's drawn on a big cloth. And one of the main, when we're looking at a world map, medieval world map, these were called Mappa Mundi, Mundi being of the world, so map of the world. And so there are 4 major types of medieval world maps in the Christian West. And we've looked at each one of these a little bit, and we're going to look at them in a little more detail so you can see the range. So I mentioned those Macrobian maps, which are these maps that are emphasizing the Earth's sphericity and the fact that there's these zones, the cold zones, the torrid zone, the temperate zone, and the fact that there's another one of those on the southern half of the hemisphere. These TO maps, which we saw the emperor holding one of those in his sphere. Then there's another map we haven't seen, which is it's a kind of a combination between a TO map and a zonal Macrobian map. And then finally we have these giant maps, or the big complex world maps that are teaching something more. And so I want to look at all 4 of these types of maps in a little bit of detail. So we talked before already, we saw an example of what I would call the Macrobian maps, or the zonal map. And this is the one that has north at the top. So it's unlike other Roman maps where we're orienting ourselves with east at the top. And there's a reason for it, because when you're emphasizing the Earth's sphericity, then it does make sense to either put north or south at the top, because if you were just putting east at the top, east continues to go on, right? So there's not a east pole and a west pole of the Earth's sphericity. The Earth has a north and a south pole, and it is rotating on that axis. And so that's why for modern times, and also for the Macrobian maps, which are emphasizing the sphericity, and for Arab maps as well that are also doing the same, that you either pick north or south to be at the top. And so I mentioned again that these maps, they're harder for us to kind of even see how it works. You just have to remember that you want to look at the top half to see the oikomenoi, the known world of the medievals and also the Romans, and then Europe in this is in the upper left corner. Arabia in that portion is in the bottom right corner, and then there's the ocean along the equator, and then there's this unknown continent that's below, And you can even see it says down there in the Latin, if you can read it, it says temperata antipodum, which is to say the antipodes, these people that are living with their feet upside down because they're on the bottom of the planet from us. So again, Macrobius had a commentary on Cicero's Gem of Scipio where he talks about this, and people took the opportunity to put these maps in this very popular medieval manuscript. So there's hundreds of these, I think, that survive. I mentioned that we looked at al-Idrisi's map. So this is this 12th century Muslim map that is made, actually commissioned by a Christian king, but anyway, drawing upon Islamic geography sources and science. It's nevertheless also built on this same idea that there are these climate zones. And you can see on there the lines, right? So that's showing those same climate zones. And you can even see that they're rounded because what he's showing here is, again, that the world is a sphere. And I just mentioned again that in this case, south is at the top. And so that's why to see the part that you'd recognize Europe, you have to look upside down to kind of understand this. And so this is also built upon, both this and the Macrobian maps are built upon what we call sometimes Ptolemaic Greek tradition. So you probably have heard of Ptolemy because of the Ptolemaic system of astronomy and astrology, the idea that the Earth is at the center of the universe and that all of the planets and fixed stars are in crystal celestial spheres that are moving around the Earth. And so Ptolemy, in addition to being the antiquities' leading astronomer, astrologer, was also the leader of classical geography, and he produced a major geographic tradition that ends up getting lost in the West, but people only remember things like the Macrobian map. Nevertheless, it is very influential for Islamic geography, including here Idrisi. And so we can say here, here's Idrisi's other map. So I showed you before Idrisi's kind of world map. What this is, actually, it's a full geography. He created an entire atlas and actually descriptions of the world. Again, it's so hard for us to put south at the top, probably. So you can see, if you turn your head upside down anyway, you can see especially Europe is going to look very familiar in the lower right-hand corner. You can kind of make out Spain and Britain down in the corner, and Italy and Sicily probably, because this is a based in Sicily where this is made. Greece, there's the Black Sea, Turkey, and you can see Arabia, and you can see Egypt with the Nile coming up to the top, and then the big dot in the middle there is the Caspian Sea. Going off there is China and India, and so on. What this actually is all of the individual blow-up maps of all the different regions from al-Idrisi's book, his atlas, that are now pieced together in modern times to show what it would look like if you stuck all of those together. It's essentially creating a coordinate geography system that's kind of similar to what we would do now. It's not quite, but anyway, this idea of, it's not longitude and latitude, but it's kind of like that idea. So this is based, ultimately goes back to the roots of, like I say, Ptolemy's geography in the 2nd century. This is a 13th century Byzantine or Greek East map that is illustrating Ptolemy's geography. And so Ptolemy here, it's got north at the top, so you can understand it. It's on a different kind of a map projection. So it's showing a map projection here of the northeastern semi-hemisphere. And you can see again up in the upper left, fairly recognizable and identifiable Europe. But you can see that same slant of Italy, where Italy is far more east and west than actual Italy, has that kind of thing. And that is what, if you remember, if we go back here, that's what's happening. Oh, here it is. That's also happening here on Idrisi's map, right? So there's these things that Romans sort of had in their heads and had wrong, that they kind of thought the world would be like. And so we see hints of that in medieval maps that make their way both through the Greek East, the Byzantines, through the Arab, Middle East and North Africa, and also in remnants through the medieval Western tradition. And so this is the 4 combined sections of Italy and Sicily from, again, al-Idrisi's atlas that he created for Roger, the Tabula Rogeriana, in 1154, the 12th century. It's a really beautiful map. This is upside down. So, in other words, this is showing north at the top. I just did that so you can understand it. But you can see Italy, the Adriatic, and Sicily is the big island there, which is where this map was made. So, here's another example. So, when Ptolemy's geography was recovered in the West, it was originally made in the 2nd century. We don't have any maps from the 2nd century, so we don't exactly know what the maps would have looked like when Ptolemy made them. Nothing survived. But he did give a coordinate system, and so you can kind of figure out what it would be like. And so this is a 17th century, in other words, a Renaissance, an early modern map of Ptolemy. So it's not using all of the actual seacoast information that people knew about because of the Portolano charts, but instead it's trying to recover the lost maps of Ptolemy. And you can again see Italy is doing this thing where it is far more horizontal. I mean, it's actually much more diagonal in terms of it doesn't really do this thing where it goes west to east like that. But the Romans kind of thought it did. So there's a wonderful little map that exists in the Vatican. I actually went and saw this in the Vatican Museum called the Borgia map. It's hard to see it here again. But I'll just try to describe this to you. It's on metal. It's on a metal disc, which is just like al-Idrisi's original map, which was built on this giant silver disc that, unfortunately, I mean, the problem with it, if you're ever going to make something out of gold or silver, people are going to melt it down, so you gotta, if it doesn't make it into the British Museum or whatever, generally speaking, these, most of these kind of things get raided at some point or other. So it didn't really last very long, the original of it. We think that little beautiful diagram that I showed you from the 12th century is a fairly good representation of what it would look like, but it was probably the actual silver disc would have been much more detailed like this one is. And so this one, the Borgia map, is made many centuries later. It's only called the Borgia map because the Borgia cardinals had it in their collection. And so we don't actually know necessarily where it's from that. Again, south is at the top. It has many of these kind of forms that are very similar to al-Idrisi. And so it could have been based on an independent tradition that's going back to al-Idrisi. And we're getting that kind of a tradition. But what's happened now, by the time it's gotten to the 15th century, Europeans have a much more inflated sense of their importance than they had in the Middle Ages. And so this is the known world again. But if you can kind of see, the Mediterranean is up kind of at the top of the map now, and then Europe is quite huge, and so Africa is tiny and Asia is tiny. And so it ends up being a very interesting and also, kind of talking about a change in European perceptions of even self-perceptions. Okay, so that was where we were just talking about these zonal maps and this first type, zonal or Macrobian, or actually ultimately going back to Ptolemaic and also related to the Muslim maps. The second one here that we talked about is this TO map. And so I showed you before the emperor here holding his little TO map. And you can see it in this blow up of, this is literally the most common medieval map. Medieval people were able to, if they wanted to talk about what the world was, this was the easiest shorthand for explaining the known world, and they could just put it in the margin of pretty much any book. And so there's hundreds and hundreds of these that have survived. And they're in this very simple form, which is you take a circle, the world is a sphere, and the known world is also portrayed as a circle on that sphere, which is to say the northeastern hemisphere. The northeastern hemisphere is divided into 3 continents which are unequal in size, because Asia is half of the space, and then Europe and Africa together are half the space in terms of the known world. And they are separated by water, so Europe is separated from Africa by the Mediterranean Sea. Europe is separated from Asia by the Tanais River, the Don River, I think it's what it's called now. And so in other words, in Ukraine, there's a border between Europe and Africa, but it's a river that's the border. And likewise, Europe and Asia. And likewise, the border between Africa and Asia is actually the Nile. And so eastern part of Egypt and Sinai and everything like that, that's all part of Asia, according to the original Greek continental scheme. So yeah, the Don River. And so there's a diagram essentially of what this means. So this is the oikoumene, or the known world, divided into the ancient idea of continents. The Mediterranean, we say Mediterranean very easily. You can hear the Latin in that pretty easy. Media, terra, so Middle Earth. Terra is earth in Latin, media. And so it represents, really frankly, the Roman world, not the medieval or European world. So the Romans were focused on the Mediterranean, and they thought of their world as including dominion over Asia, Europe, and Africa. For the medieval West, of course, people are confined really to the edge. So the medieval Christians, who are continuing to make these Roman maps, are kind of consigned to the lower left-hand corner of the map. So what's the advantage? Why would we do this map that, with east at the top, and it's such a simple thing? The reality is that, before the printing press, and also for just talking to school kids, if you try to draw a very complex drawing of anything, you have to have a fairly sophisticated artist or a system like Ptolemy had in order to get anybody to reproduce the thing. In point of fact, it doesn't take very long through some unartistically gifted copyists before, so you can keep text the same, and it can be pretty good again and again and again. A scribe can be taught that, but in terms of art, it's not always as easy to just have somebody who's a scribe to reproduce, let's say, artwork or a picture. And so what a TO map really does is it describes in simplest terms how Romans understood the world to be put together. And they are able to reproduce it without making any mistakes. People don't have to worry about, how do you make a TO map? You can draw those very easily. You can draw it right now, probably without, you don't have to even be looking at it, just based on how I've explained it to you. So TO maps are therefore useful for that way, but then the problem with them is, of course, is that they're not conveying very much information. And so that they're not conveying all of the information, even, for example, that the Macrobian maps conveyed. There is another map that has a very prominent family of maps in the Middle Ages. It isn't necessarily telling us too much in terms of map information, but it's anyway, we'll talk about it. So it's called the Beatus family. So in the 8th century, there's a Spanish monk named Beatus of Liébana, who is the author of a very popular commentary on the Apocalypse. And so people were very excited about the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. And Beatus has people were always writing commentaries. What does this book mean? And so Beatus has one of those. And these are just gorgeously illustrated in the very early medieval Spanish style. You can kind of see an example of it. If you go through medieval Spanish illuminated manuscripts, you can see immediately where Picasso comes from. The history is like right there. There's so many just amazing imagery in this thing. So it's a very heavily illustrated book, and it includes in every one of them, generally speaking, a map. The maps are very highly stylized, and they are a composite between the zonal and the TO type. And so this is an example of one of them. We've got east at the top. You can kind of see in the middle of it is the Mediterranean, the Don River, the Nile there. And then you can see, though, Africa is sliced by that ocean. The ocean isn't being shown in the equator, but that's the equator on this map. They're not giving half of the space to this area of the world that they don't know anything about, because they wouldn't have anything to put there except for, again, an antipodes. And so the idea of, it means person with the foot upside down. So now they have started to take that literally, and instead of thinking of it as the guy who is on the other side of the planet, and so therefore their feet are upside down, like I showed in that other diagram, they're thinking of it as a mythical race here with one big foot that he uses and to shade himself from the horrible sun. And so anyway, what you can kind of see here is trying to convey some of these ideas, but getting it all garbledy, in part because really Beatus is mostly worried about talking about the apocalypse and is showing other things. And so what he's actually showing here in this map is there's all of these places where important saints, where important apostles are buried, including in Spain's case, at the bottom here, the bottom left, the shrine of Santiago, the shrine of St. James the Greater, one of the apostles that the medieval Spanish people claimed to have the bones of, that became this great pilgrimage shrine, Santiago de Compostela, that everybody would come and make pilgrimages to. So this is kind of a zoom in on a Beatus map of Europe, the European quadrant, and I've turned it so that north is at the top so you can kind of see it. And you've got there on in what's Spain, the place has got the biggest shrine and church. That's, I think, the shrine of Santiago de Compostela. So what really these maps are doing is not showing where coasts are. This is a schematic map. They're not, they are showing the fact that the world is a sphere and that there's this place, the Antipodes, that is on the other side of the equator that the apostles were never able to get to. But it's not interested in spatial accuracy. It's actually really trying to show the various legendary missions of the apostles to bring the gospel to the whole 4 quarters of the earth, and unfortunately they can't get to the 1 quarter down there with the Antipodes. This is a really beautiful Beatus map. It's probably the most elaborated one, and you can again see the kind of the middle is the Mediterranean. You can see the area up to the Black Sea and the Don River. The Nile is in the part of Africa. It's called Libya. You can read it maybe. The Red Sea and the Persian Gulf are both going into this ocean that is all colored in red, and it's all called Red Sea. And then the Antipodes is now just a little sliver on this particular map. Another thing that figures into these maps you can see up in the east, if you read in the book of Genesis, God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and so that's where the Garden of Eden is off in the east. And so it's also, in addition to being a schematic map, it's primarily a theological map that is illustrating, again, these commentaries, biblical commentaries. Here's another example. You can see Adam and Eve are even more prominent on this because they're not showing a lot of the other details. This is a person who's maybe not as good at drawing maps. But anyway, you can see that these all come from a common source, and you can see how different each one of these Beatus maps is. And so this is the kind of problem why I said a TO map is really useful, because if you start, even a person's copying these, they either simplifies, there's a whole tree of how these all fit together, and and you can see just kind of by how a telephone game works. I mean, you can still see, again, there's the sea with the Antipodes, you can see Adam and Eve, you can see the Nile, you can see the Don, you can see the Mediterranean. Spain is called out, but anyway, it's not the same looking as the other ones. Okay, so we've looked at the zonal or Macrobian maps, the TO maps, the Beatus maps, and then that leaves the last type, which are called sometimes the complex maps, or essentially the great Mappa Mundi, so the maps of the world that have all the real big level of detail that are so beautiful, including the largest medieval map that has survived, the Hereford map, so named because it's been preserved for centuries in Hereford Cathedral. It was created around the year 1300. And so these, again, this is a really big map. So it's the size of a full cow, right? So it's a full leather hide here. And so you can see it's a circle. So you're still seeing this is still representing the same kind of zone as a TO map, which is to say the northeastern hemisphere, semi-hemisphere. And so this is the northeastern oikoumene, the Roman world as the Romans knew it. You can see in the middle again, anyway, it's Asia, Europe, Africa. In the middle is the Mediterranean, the Don, and the Nile. And you can also see very prominently in red the Red Sea. And so that's where, and then in this case, in the center, Jerusalem. And so this is kind of like the culmination of a medieval schematic map that has actually a painting of a medieval worldview. There's so much stuff on this thing that it's essentially a virtual encyclopedia of medieval knowledge, and we'll look at some of the details on it to get how sort of medieval people think. In the first place, we'll mention that maps like the Hereford map are based on much earlier ones that are based on Roman originals. I showed you this one before. I called it the Anglo-Saxon or Cotton map. So this particular copy is from the early 11th century, so from Anglo-Saxon times, as opposed to later Norman times, like the Hereford map. And you can see it already has some of these details. It has Italy, so east is at the top, remember. So I have a detail here of Italy, and you can see Italy is, again, it's horizontal, right? And so it's horizontal that way. And you can see a big, the biggest city that's called out here is Roma. You can see other characteristics that are going to be very common throughout all of these, but one of them is, for example, that the Nile has its origin in the east, that the Arabian Peninsula is sort of looks like Sinai to us. It's sort of a triangle, and that there's sort of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf are on either side of that. The Caspian Sea, if you look at the upper northeastern corner, the upper left corner, the Caspian Sea has an outlet to the ocean, so the Caspian Sea is not encircled or enclosed sea. So those are some of the characteristics that are on almost all of these Roman maps, and it also occurs here in this particular medieval map. One of the things that's also on it is all of those lines. You can see borders. Borders is not something that has survived otherwise, and those are defining Roman provinces largely. So Romans showing those kind of things. So the borders actually in the 11th century, in the year 1025, these Roman provinces did not exist. So there was no longer did Cappadocia exist as a place, or what does it say? Asia Minor, Cilicia, Cappadocia, all of these kind of places, Anatolia, all of those places are gone, and this is largely now, it's Byzantium, but it's largely going to become Turkey. All of these kinds of all of these things that are preserved from Roman times, they don't have the new information to update their maps. They're copying from early times. And interestingly, sometimes when people are making a map, they'll put themselves at the center of the universe. So they'll put, I showed on al-Idrisi's map, Mecca is at the center of the universe. On this later, sometimes Jerusalem is at the center. The people who are making these in England, they're really living on the very edge of the map. And so this map is actually being drawn or copied and produced in Britain, and that's really at the periphery, or the edge of the planet. So this is another map where you can kind of see an evolution from that Roman form, and you're getting to what these big, giant, great medieval Mappa Mundi are like. And this one's called the Isidore map, and so it's a 11th century map. You can see there's a Red Sea again that's colored in red. The Mediterranean, Sicily here in the Mediterranean is actually drawn as a direct triangle, which is pretty cool. For some reason, Jerusalem's not in the center, but Acre is on a little peninsula there. That Europe is again in the lower left because east is at the top. The Nile is having its origin in the east. And you can kind of see I've got a blow up detail here from Africa, and that's where they are showing all kind of the wild animals and beasts, so dragons and lions and wyverns and all those kind of things that are being depicted there.
The Psalter map is another one of these. It's really tiny, from a Christian prayer book for would have been for a noble, and you can see that it's showing Christ in judgment over the world with two angels that are attending him. He himself is holding one of these little TO maps, and so he's doing the same thing like the emperor or the kings do, showing kind of dominion. And then you can see the how essentially the a more Christianized version of this Roman map is emerging. So now Jerusalem is at the center of this little map that is really quite a gorgeous little piece of work that has gone. So if we look at kind of the details of it, if we go right in the center of it on the left here, you can see Jerusalem is shown as a circle, and so Jerusalem is now being called the umbilicus mundi, the belly button of the world. And that's seen as being the center, anyway, of the northeastern oikoumενoi, the northeastern semi-hemisphere. And then you can see kind of also, very interestingly, all drawn out, all of the kind of the barbarous peoples in Africa, the Blemies and kind of Cephales and Antipodes and all those guys that are being shown on the peripheries of the map. So essentially the mythical races that medieval people are reading about when they're reading their good old Roman scientist historians like Pliny the Elder, who are describing all of the exotic things that they know about or pretend they know about. So yeah, here's a little blow up of that even closer. So we've got cannibals here, Blemies, Antipodes, and others. So you can see the cannibals on the left are eating legs. Cannibal is like a shorthand for people who are beyond civilization. Whether it's not even always clear that reports of cannibalism are correct. It might just be that again, that's part of just people anticipate that if you're an alien to us, you're a cannibal. But you can also see like the Blemies, where they don't have heads, they have their faces on their chest. And where's the Antipodes? So at the very edge at the right is a guy who's only got the one leg or whatever. He's going to use it to shield him from the sun. Those are the Antipodes. Okay, so the one of the biggest ones of these unfortunately didn't survive. It's called the Ebsdorf map, and it would have been super cool, I mean, had it survived. We fortunately have a reasonable copies of it. This was in Germany, and it was destroyed in World War II. And so it does almost exactly the same thing. It has Jerusalem at the center, and also is showing the whole ecumenoe as Christ's body. And so the Hereford map, though, is one that has survived. It's now the largest surviving. Britain, as I say, is on the edge of the world. At the top is Christ in judgment, sort of similar to the Psalter map. And you can see Mary interceding for everybody. You can see the righteous dead being resurrected and the damned being led away on the right. It has all of those same monstrous races on the edge of the world, the Blemies, the cannibals. There's a sphinx, there's a centaur, there's a rhinoceros, a leopard, a lion, a basilisk. So in other words, everything that they've read about in the crocodiles right there, everything that they've read about from the Romans, they aren't able to see basilisks anymore. There aren't any basilisks, but same thing, rhinoceroses or lions, those are not something that they have access to anymore in England. There's also the classical inheritance. And so, you have on this area of Scythia, which is to say Ukraine, on the one hand, you have Essidones, in other words, cannibals, people eating cannibals, but you can also see on there the golden fleece, which is, from the Greek myths of Jason and the Argonauts, and that's actually where that takes place according to that myth. There's also a griffin there, which is much more kind of like a medieval style monster. They also have the biblical inheritance. So you can see here around the Dead Sea and also in Egypt, you can see the border or a golden line there that's drawn out. That's the wandering of the children of Israel from Egypt into the Promised Land, and they goes from, therefore, Egypt, wandering all around to Sinai, and then ultimately across the Jordan River into Jericho. Also on this, in terms of the diagrams, there's the Tower of Babel. There's Lot's wife by the Dead Sea being turned into a pillar of salt, and the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are placed there in the Dead Sea, destroyed by God in the Bible. It also shows Abraham coming from the city of Ur. So in other words, there's also, in addition to the classical inheritance, there's also the biblical inheritance portrayed. At the very farthest part of the east is pictured the Garden of Eden. St. Augustine, who's so influential in the West, is shown in his city of Hippo, and the crucifixion of Christ is shown in this, again, circular Jerusalem in the Umbilicus Mundi. The labyrinth of the Minotaur is pictured on Crete, and we also have the lighthouse in the city of Alexandria. But even though we have the lighthouse in Alexandria, we have Augustine in North Africa, not pictured at all. This is 1300. This is after centuries of crusades. There's not even any hint of Muslim occupation of the Middle East and North Africa. Muslims are simply not even listed on this map, which is very strange and interesting, talking to us about how medievals are identifying either the world or an idealized world. So, to sum up, Mappa Mundi. What we have here really are schematic diagrams that are theological and cosmological. They're not spatial. They're not temporal. They're not listing what borders are like now. They're not listing what history is like now. They're not also showing coastlines or anything spatially. The goal is not to use these for navigation. They weren't used for navigation. Rather, they're categorizing the world and everything in it. They're ultimately based on Roman originals, the final flowering, frankly, of the living tradition of Roman mapping, but they completely, as a result, ignore recent history because they're so focused on the classical sources. Oh, here it is. So, just as though what ended up happening, the conscious revival of classical Latin that happened during the Renaissance as people started studying Cicero and trying to write like Cicero, that ended up killing the living language of medieval Latin, which had been an ongoing thing. It was not, unlike what the people in the Renaissance thought, a literal rebirth of Roman civilization. It was rather something very new, but it was a new thing that made Latin a dead language. Likewise, modern mapping was not a revival of ancient Roman mapping or ancient Roman science. It was a new kind of science, and it combined the medieval invention, which is to say of portal and sea charts, with that revival of Ptolemy. And what it did, though, was ultimately displace and kill the living tradition of Roman mapping, which is in some ways fine because it wasn't as useful for the kinds of things that modern mapping ended up being used for. But hopefully you'll now see what these are for and why they're not, as people tend to look at these and say, boy, these guys didn't know what they were talking about at all. In fact, they knew what they wanted to talk about, and they talked about it very well for what their goals were. So that, in short, is mapping the medieval worldview using these kinds of medieval maps so that we can understand what medieval people felt, that medieval Westerners felt that the world was like. And so I'm going to ask if there are any questions that people have had, or if that's reactions to any of these, or people have thoughts, or anyway, want clarification on any of these kind of things. I know I gave you guys a lot of information, and this went on a little longer than I thought it was going to. I can't help it. I start looking at these maps, and there's so many incredible details on them, and so anyway, thanks for putting up with me. I really enjoy these things. Let's see if we can. If I'm getting any. Here we go. Okay, there are some questions here. Actually, several. Ron Wagner asks, are there any Viking maps? Great question. There is a very famous Viking map, which is a forgery. So there's a map that's called the Vinland map. And so for a whole long time, there's a lot of scholars that were trying to argue that this is a real map, and that this was, and that it's actually also a map that it's showing for the first time North America, so the Vikings' discovery of North America. But I think that we're pretty clear from most recent scholarship that this is not a that this is a modern forgery. And so I think actually no, I don't think there are any actual Viking maps, and I don't think the Vikings used maps in order to navigate. So just because we think of everything as that maps are necessary, for a huge proportion of human navigation, people weren't really using maps to do it, but it became a thing that was actually more or less after the Viking Age in the Mediterranean is when it especially develops this kind of sea charts. So, Leandro has a modern map that he put in that he also sent into the link here, which is to say 1690. So the Vikings are much earlier and stuff like that than that, right? Oh, so it's saying this from the last map from the 16th century, but even so. So, Roan Wagner asks, are there any Native American maps? So, yes, there are. So there are maps that are drawn on the back of like buffalo hides and things like that, and they are also not they're not spatial in the sense of coastlines or drawing grid or anything like that. It's a relative map again, so it's showing how different groups and their territories are related to each other in a kind of a schematic and spatial way. So yes, there are a couple of those that have survived, thank heavens. And there's also, for example, these are not Native Americans, but for example, Polynesians have certain kinds of stick maps that are used, for example, to show kind of ocean currents and things like that, for their very impressive feats of colonization that they had of the Pacific. Ron Wagner asks, isn't the separation of Europe and Asia the Ural Mountains? So, not classically. So that is not what continents were understood to be. So we now have a new definition of continents, and in fact, frankly, by our new definition of continent, which is to say a large landmass that's largely surrounded by ocean, Europe doesn't actually qualify as a continent anymore. Europe is really part of Asia, Eurasia, in the sense a subcontinent of Asia, in the same way that India is a subcontinent of Asia or China is a subcontinent of Asia. In terms of being separated off by mountains. And so now the subcontinent of Europe we call it a continent because it's been called one the entire time, but anyway, it's really separated off by the Ural Mountains, as that's sometimes understood to be. But always classically, it was the river, so it was the water that was understood to separate it. It's a different idea of what a continent even is. And the idea of the three continents derives from the ancient Greeks, and the ancient Greeks aren't really even they don't think of the Ural Mountains, they're thinking of living in what we now think of as Greece, living in Turkey, and living in Egypt. And so they're thinking of the world of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Mediterranean like that, and they're dividing it that way. And so that's where the conception comes from. It doesn't make sense for our modern idea of continents, which ultimately has its roots in that. But yeah, so people will divide Europe from Asia with the Ural Mountains. It really is not. Like I say, Europe shouldn't really qualify as a continent based on the new idea of what we think of as continents. I'll just ask Leandro, are there any other questions? Miss anything? I can't hear you, Leandro. Are there any other questions? Well, not seeing any. Anyway, I thank you for bearing with me. I hope you found that interesting, and I hope you'll join us next week for when we do talk about Vikings, and we're going to talk about Viking religion and why the Vikings gave up their religion ultimately, and so what happened with all that. So thank you very much, and we will talk to you next week.